Michael Behe is a well-known skeptic of evolution, and now an evolution professor has gone off. He's calling Michael Behe a liar. Let's have a look.
So right off the bat, the framing of this whole article is going to be dishonest. How he dishonestly goes about, he knows how science works and how theoretical frameworks evolve. He's just dishonestly presenting it. Wow, this dude is full of it. He's clearly just lying here. And Behe is still telling the same lies. And this is another example of a gross misrepresentation. The degree of dishonesty packed into that paragraph is astonishing. Other than Behe is just lying to your face. If you're reading this as like someone who just peruses evolution news, Behe is lying to you, straight up, profoundly dishonest. And I know Michael Behe knows better. That paragraph, again, is astonishing in its dishonesty. Pretty subtle by the standards of creationists, but it's a very common trick and you should always be on the lookout for it. An extremely dishonest presentation of how this field operates. And dishonestly, because there's no other possible explanation here, and I'm confident saying it is dishonesty rather than ignorance, no way that man genuinely thinks that's the case, which means he's lying. It's lines like that that make it clear that Michael Behe is definitely lying.
Okay, a lot of accusations from this evolution professor. But why? What is the main accusation? It is that Behe purposefully misrepresents evolutionary theory. So in other words, the accusation is that Behe is erecting a straw man argument. That is the evolution professor's argument, and it is a serious accusation. Saying you're wrong is one thing. Saying that you're lying is quite another. You better have your facts straight, because in public discourse, the only thing worse than lying is falsely accusing someone else of lying. But that is what evolutionists do. I do have plenty of experience with this. In this case, those supposed evolutionary mechanisms are indeed a mystery. The evolution professor's accusations are all false. Here is a paper that admits how fundamental innovations or novelties originate in evolution remains one of the most enigmatic questions of biology. This paper admits how body pattern evolves in nature remains largely unknown. This paper appeals to an unknown mechanism. Are all those papers lying? Evolutionary theory lacks obvious, plausible causes to create the species. That's just what the science is telling us. So the first false claim from the evolution professor is that obvious and plausible evolutionary causes that created the species are well understood. No, they aren't. The second false claim is that Behe is lying. No, he is not. But it gets worse, because next, the evolution professor attempts to provide examples.
I teach evolutionary biology every year. I teach a 200-level evolutionary biology course, and we spend an entire day of class on how do new traits evolve. That is a topic for one of the days of class during the semester. We go through various mechanisms of how you can recruit proteins that do one job to have a different job. Processes like neofunctionalization and subfunctionalization, gene duplication and horizontal gene transfer. These are not questions that are foreign to evolutionary biologists. We talk about this stuff all the time, and it's one of the big things that evolutionary biologists investigate.
Okay, let's have a look at this. The evolution professor talks about how he teaches this class every year, a 200-level evolutionary biology course, and how they spend an entire day on this topic of how new traits evolve. They talk about the mechanisms and so forth. We go through these various mechanisms of how you can recruit proteins that do one job to have a different job. Well, that's teleological right off the bat. Evolution rejects teleology. Evolution cannot recruit proteins to have a new function. That doesn't work. That's not how it works. But such false claims pervade evolutionary thought, because if you speak scientifically, the problems are more obvious. I'm not being picky here because this pervades evolutionary thought, as anyone who views this channel knows. So, our third false claim, evolution recruits proteins to have a different function. Skipping down now, processes like neofunctionalization and subfunctionalization, gene duplication, horizontal gene transfer. The evolution professor lists off these various mechanisms. These are all false claims. So let's look at horizontal gene transfer. The evolution professor claims that horizontal gene transfer, or HGT, is an obvious, well-understood evolutionary mechanism in the origin of species. First off, horizontal gene transfer is also called lateral gene transfer. So you'll see HGT or you'll see LGT. They mean the same thing. Horizontal gene transfer is a general term for mechanisms that transfer genetic material between organisms, other than by inheritance. So here's a cartoon that shows various mechanisms, transduction, conjugation, transformation, etc., that transfer genetic material between organisms. Horizontal gene transfer. The evolution professor's horizontal gene transfer claim fails for several reasons. First, if evolution is true, then the transferred gene must have already evolved. In other words, you're not explaining how a new gene evolved. So going back to our cartoon here, transduction, conjugation, etc., all of these mechanisms are importing an already existing gene. No gene is being evolved. It's just being moved, transferred between organisms. So our first failure here is that horizontal gene transfer provides a gene, yes, but that gene already exists in the biosphere. This is not a new gene. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with horizontal gene transfer. I like horizontal gene transfer. It is a cool adaptation mechanism and is very powerful. Now second, horizontal gene transfer is a complicated mechanism and it's needed in early evolutionary history. In the supposed evolutionary history, horizontal gene transfer helps early organisms avoid mutational overload. But the chance origin of horizontal gene transfer is unlikely, especially in early evolution. Horizontal gene transfer mechanisms, such as transformation, require complicated molecular machines. Furthermore, selection will not likely be very strong. So back to our cartoon, these various mechanisms, including transformation, are complicated. They involve molecular machines. You have to move these genes, this genetic material, from outside the cell to inside the cell, and ultimately be using it inside the cell. This isn't for free. This doesn't just happen. So it's complicated. It's not likely to arise by chance. Now, evolutionists talk about different scenarios by which horizontal gene transfer could have evolved. On the left there, maybe horizontal gene transfer evolved because it helps the population survive. It provides adaptation, it provides fitness. Or on the right, maybe horizontal gene transfer evolved fortuitously as a side effect of, say, DNA intake mechanisms. So your cell is taking in DNA that's in the environment. It's like nutrition, and then as a side effect, you evolve horizontal gene transfer. Of course, more would have to be done. You can't merely have DNA intake. That's not horizontal gene transfer. You need more. But either way, it doesn't matter. Regardless of how horizontal gene transfer is envisioned to have evolved, it's difficult. It is a challenge for evolution. This is low probability. So, the second failure of this horizontal gene transfer claim, the origin of horizontal gene transfer is a challenge for evolution. This is not evidence for evolution. This is a difficulty. This is a challenge because, for several reasons, it must evolve rapidly in early evolution. It's a complicated mechanism. This is a low probability event. And you're going to have weak selection on top of that. Okay, third, an appeal to horizontal gene transfer as a key evolutionary mechanism means horizontal gene transfer evolved. But that means evolution created evolution. Remember, teleology is not allowed. There can be no foresight. So evolution luckily happened to create horizontal gene transfer. There was no plan, which turned out to be a key evolutionary mechanism. In other words, evolution created evolution. This is serendipity, and serendipity is a bad sign in science. So our third problem here, appeals to horizontal gene transfer introduce serendipity. So no, horizontal gene transfer is not an obvious, well-understood evolutionary mechanism for creating the species. Horizontal gene transfer is not helping to explain how the species evolved. So we have our fourth false claim. Horizontal gene transfer is an obvious, well-understood evolutionary mechanism in the origin of species. No, false. Another false claim that pervades the video is that Behe is a creationist. The evolution professor repeats this throughout the video. Of course, Behe is not a creationist, but the evolution professor knows that. The evolution professor is well familiar with Behe and his work, and the origins debate in general. That becomes obvious from the video. In fact, the evolution professor states that he has been in communication with Behe. The evolution professor also is undoubtedly well familiar with horizontal gene transfer. In other words, the evolution professor knows everything I've been talking about. He knows better. The evolution professor is doing what he accuses Behe of.